Beneath the crushing weight of the world's oceans, hidden in the lightless abyss of the Mariana Trench, scattered across the shifting sands of the Sahara, and buried beneath the ancient ice of Antarctica, lies the greatest ghost story ever told. It is a story of a utopian civilization, a society of unparalleled wealth, advanced technology, and profound wisdom. A society that, at the absolute height of its imperial power, was swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of catastrophic misfortune. We call it Atlantis. For over 2 millennia, the legend of Atlantis has captivated the human imagination. It has inspired countless books, movies, and expeditions. Treasure hunters have bankrupted themselves searching for its sunken pillars. Pseudoscientists have built entire careers claiming to channel its ancient wisdom. And geologists have scoured the globe from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean looking for a physical footprint of a lost empire. But what if we have been looking at the story all wrong? What if Atlantis was never a place you could find on a map? Or conversely, what if the myth is actually a distorted, fragmented memory of a real, historical cataclysm that nearly wiped out human civilization? To separate the hidden history from the mythological fiction, we must strip away centuries of pop culture, occultism, and internet conspiracy theories. We must travel back to the very beginning. We must return to ancient Greece, to the writings of a single philosopher, and ask the most fundamental question of all. Where did the story of Atlantis actually come from? Unlike the myths of King Arthur or Robin Hood, which evolved over centuries through countless anonymous storytellers, the story of Atlantis has a definitive, singular point of origin. It was not born from the oral traditions of ancient sailors. It was written down by one man, the Athenian philosopher Plato. Around 360 BCE, Plato wrote 2 dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. These texts are the alpha and omega of the Atlantis legend. Every single detail we have about the lost city, its location, its layout, its history, and its demise comes exclusively from these 2 works. If Plato had not written them, Atlantis would simply not exist. According to Plato, the story did not originate in Greece. He claims it was brought to Athens nearly 200 years earlier by the great Greek lawmaker and poet, Solon. Around 590 BCE, Solon traveled to the city of Sais in Egypt. There, he engaged in a discussion with an elderly Egyptian priest. When Solon began to boast about the ancient history of the Greeks, the priest laughed at him, delivering a line that would echo through history. He told Solon that the Greeks were always children and that there was not an old man among them. He explained that the Greeks had no antiquity of history and no history of antiquity because their civilization had been repeatedly destroyed by cataclysms, forcing them to start over from scratch. The Egyptians, however, protected by the predictable flooding of the Nile, had kept unbroken records for thousands of years. The priest then revealed to Solon the history of a great power that existed 9,000 years prior. This empire, the priest explained, was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, which separates Spain from Morocco. This empire was Atlantis. Plato's description of Atlantis in the Critias is astonishingly detailed. He describes an island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. At its center was a magnificent city built in a series of concentric rings, 3 rings of water and 2 rings of land. The city was a marvel of engineering, connected by massive canals and bridges that allowed ships to sail all the way to the center. The architecture was constructed from stone quarried directly from the island, stone that was white, black, and red. The wealth of Atlantis was beyond measure. Plato writes of a mysterious, reddish metal called orichalcum, which was mined on the island and used to coat the walls of the central citadel so that it flashed with the red light of fire. The central temple was dedicated to Poseidon and his mortal wife Cleito and was covered in silver and gold. The land was incredibly fertile, producing 2 harvests a year, watered by hot and cold springs that the Atlanteans had engineered into public baths. They possessed exotic flora and fauna, including, famously, a large population of elephants. But Atlantis was not just a paradise, it was a military superpower. The island was divided into 10 provinces, each ruled by a king who was a direct descendant of Poseidon. The High King commanded a massive fleet of 1,200 ships, and an army of over 1 million men, complete with 10,000 chariots. Driven by greed and hubris, the empire expanded, conquering parts of Europe and Africa and eventually launching a massive invasion of the Mediterranean. It was here, according to the Egyptian priest, that the ancient prehistoric city of Athens stood against them. This early version of Athens was a perfect society, modeled on Plato's own philosophical ideals of justice and virtue. The Athenians, though vastly outnumbered, fought with incredible bravery. They defeated the Atlantean armada, pushed them back, and liberated the Mediterranean. But the ultimate destruction of Atlantis did not come from the Athenians. It came from the gods. As the generations passed, the divine blood of the Atlanteans became diluted with mortal blood. The people of Atlantis became arrogant, corrupt, and obsessed with material wealth. Seeing this, Zeus, the king of the gods, called a council of the Olympians to decide their punishment. Plato's Critias ends abruptly, mid-sentence, just as Zeus is about to deliver his judgment. However, in the earlier Timaeus dialogue, Plato reveals the end of the story. He writes that there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the entire Atlantean war machine sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. It is a fantastic cinematic story, but did Plato intend for it to be read as history? For centuries, scholars have debated this exact question. The overwhelming consensus among classicists and historians is that Atlantis was never a real place. It was an allegory, a philosophical thought experiment designed to illustrate Plato's political theories. To understand why, we have to look at the world Plato lived in. During his lifetime, Athens was a dominant naval power, but it had become deeply imperialistic, greedy, and morally corrupt. This hubris led Athens into the disastrous Peloponnesian War against Sparta, a war that Athens lost, resulting in the collapse of its empire and the execution of Plato's mentor, Socrates. Plato despised the democratic system that had killed his teacher and ruined his city. When he wrote the story of Atlantis, he was holding up a mirror to his own society. Atlantis was not a lost utopia, it was a cautionary tale. Atlantis represented the corrupt imperialistic Athens of Plato's present day. The ancient Athenians who defeated Atlantis represented the idealized, virtuous state that Plato described in his most famous work, The Republic. The story's moral is clear. No matter how wealthy, technologically advanced, or militarily powerful a civilization becomes, if it loses its moral compass and succumbs to hubris, the gods or nature will destroy it. Furthermore, the timeline Plato provides is highly suspicious. He claims Atlantis existed 9,000 years before Solon's visit, placing its destruction around 9,600 BCE. At this time, humanity was just emerging from the last ice age. We were hunter-gatherers living in small, nomadic bands. There were no cities, no bronze weapons, no agriculture, and certainly no massive naval armadas. The idea of a highly advanced civilization existing in 9,600 BCE completely contradicts the established archaeological record. So, if Atlantis is just a philosophical allegory, why are we still looking for it? Because while the story of Atlantis may be fiction, the inspiration for the story is almost certainly rooted in a very real, very terrifying historical event. In fact, Plato didn't even have to look far into the past to find a real-life example of a city being swallowed by the sea. In the winter of 373 BCE, when Plato was in his 50s, the Greek city of Helike was destroyed. Helike was a wealthy, prosperous city located on the coast of the Gulf of Corinth. It was famous for its temple of Poseidon, the very god who would eventually destroy Atlantis in Plato's story. One night, a massive earthquake struck the region. The ground liquefied and a massive tsunami rushed in from the Gulf. By morning, Helike was gone. The entire city, along with all its inhabitants, had sunk beneath the waters. Greek historians wrote about the disaster extensively. The submerged ruins of Helike remained visible beneath the shallow waters for centuries, serving as a grim reminder of the power of the sea. It is highly probable that the sudden, catastrophic destruction of Helike provided Plato with the exact mechanism for the destruction of his fictional Atlantis. But Helike was just a single city. To find the historical kernel of a massive seafaring empire destroyed by a cataclysm, we must travel to the island of Crete and look at a civilization that flourished over 1,000 years before Plato was born. The Minoans. Around 2000 BCE, the Minoans built the first advanced civilization in Europe. They were a maritime superpower, dominating trade across the Mediterranean. They built massive multi-story palaces, like the one at Knossos, with complex plumbing systems that included flushing toilets and terracotta pipes. They created vibrant, beautiful art, and they amassed incredible wealth through the trade of copper, tin, and ceramics. Like the Atlanteans, they were a thalassocracy, an empire of the sea. They worshipped a deity closely associated with bulls, and their culture featured the dangerous sport of bull leaping, which likely inspired the later Greek myth of the Minotaur and the labyrinth. But the Minoan civilization was built on top of a geological time bomb. 70 miles north of Crete lay the island of Thera, known today as Santorini. Thera was home to a thriving Minoan colony, but around 1600 BCE, the volcano at the center of Thera violently erupted. The Minoan eruption of Thera was one of the most catastrophic volcanic events in human history. It was roughly 4 times more powerful than the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. The explosion was so loud it would have been heard thousands of miles away. The island of Thera literally blew itself apart, collapsing into the sea and forming the massive crescent-shaped caldera we see today. But the ash and pumice were only the beginning. The collapse of the island triggered massive tsunamis, with waves estimated to be over 100 feet high. These walls of water raced across the Mediterranean, slamming into the northern coast of Crete. The tsunamis obliterated the Minoan ports, destroyed their vital naval fleet, and buried their coastal settlements under a thick layer of toxic ash. The Minoan civilization never recovered. Within a couple of centuries, they were conquered by the Mycenaeans from the Greek mainland. A brilliant, advanced, seafaring culture was effectively wiped off the map by the wrath of nature. Could the destruction of the Minoans be the true story of Atlantis? The parallels are striking. An advanced, wealthy, island-based maritime power, obsessed with bulls and the sea god Poseidon, destroyed by earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the waves. But what about Plato's timeline? How do we explain the 9,000 years discrepancy? Historians suggest this could be the result of a massive game of historical telephone, compounded by a translation error. Remember, Plato claims the story came from Egyptian priests. The ancient Egyptians used a base 10 numerical system, but their symbols for 100 and 1,000 were very similar. It is highly probable that when Solon translated the Egyptian records, he misread the symbol for 100 as 1,000. Furthermore, the Egyptians often used the number 9 to symbolize a long, indefinite period of time. If Atlantis was actually destroyed 900 years before Solon's visit, that places the cataclysm around 1500 BCE. This aligns almost perfectly with the eruption of Thera and the collapse of the Minoan civilization. Over the centuries, the historical memory of the Minoan collapse was passed down through oral tradition. The story was exaggerated, mythologized, and eventually found its way into the hands of Plato, who used the fragmented memory of a real Bronze Age apocalypse as the setting for his philosophical allegory. While the Minoan hypothesis is the most widely accepted by mainstream historians, it is not the only candidate for the real Atlantis. The allure of the lost city has led explorers to propose dozens of locations across the globe. One compelling theory points to the Iberian Peninsula, specifically southern Spain. Just beyond the Pillars of Hercules, exactly where Plato said Atlantis was located, lay an ancient, semi-mythical city called Tartessos. Tartessos was a wealthy, advanced trading hub that flourished around the 9th century BCE. The Greeks and Romans wrote of Tartessos as a place of unimaginable riches, particularly in silver, copper, and tin. Some ancient texts even describe the kings of Tartessos living for thousands of years, echoing the long-lived demigods of Atlantis. Some scholars believe Tartessos is the same place referred to as Tarshish in the Bible, a distant land of great wealth. But around the 6th century BCE, Tartessos abruptly disappears from the historical record. Some archaeologists believe that a massive tsunami triggered by an earthquake wiped out the coastal city, burying it beneath the mudflats of the Donana National Park in Andalusia. Satellite imagery of the region has revealed strange geometric anomalies beneath the marshes, leading some to claim they have found the concentric rings of the Atlantean capital. However, mainstream geologists argue these are simply natural formations, and extensive archaeological surveys have yet to find a sunken metropolis. In recent years, the internet has championed a completely different location, the Rishat structure, also known as the Eye of the Sahara, located in Mauritania, West Africa. From space, the Rishat structure looks exactly like Plato's description of Atlantis, a series of massive concentric rings measuring roughly 14 miles or 23 kilometers in diameter. Proponents of this theory point out that the structure is located near the Atlantic Ocean and that the surrounding mountains match Plato's description of the Atlantean topography. They argue that Atlantis didn't sink into the ocean but was destroyed by a cataclysm that left it stranded in what is now the Sahara Desert, pointing to evidence of ancient water erosion in the area. However, geologists have thoroughly debunked this. The Risha structure is not a man-made city. It is a deeply eroded geological dome formed by volcanic uplift millions of years before humans even existed. The concentric rings are simply alternating layers of hard and soft rock worn away by wind and water over eons. Furthermore, there is absolutely no archaeological evidence of human habitation, let alone a massive Bronze Age city in the area. But what if the Minoans, Tartessos, and the Sahara are all just distractions? What if Plato's date of 9600 BCE was actually correct? What if Atlantis was a real global civilization that existed at the end of the last ice age, only to be wiped out by a planetary catastrophe? This is the premise of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a theory popularized by authors like Graham Hancock. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth was warming up, emerging from the deep freeze of the Pleistocene epoch. But suddenly the climate violently reversed. Temperatures plummeted and the planet plunged back into a deep freeze for over 1,000 years. This period is known as the Younger Dryas. Proponents of the impact hypothesis argue that this sudden climate shift was caused by a fragmented comet striking the North American ice sheet. The impact would have caused unimaginable destruction. It would have ignited continent-wide wildfires, throwing millions of tons of ash into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun. Most importantly, the heat from the comet would have instantaneously melted vast amounts of glacial ice, causing global sea levels to rise by hundreds of feet in a matter of weeks, an event known as Meltwater Pulse 1b. If an advanced maritime civilization existed on the coastlines during the Ice Age, it would have been completely obliterated. Their cities would have been swallowed by the rising oceans, their populations decimated by tsunamis and climate collapse. The survivors, scattered across the globe, would have passed down the story of the Great Flood and the lost motherland. Over millennia, this global trauma would evolve into the universal flood myths found in almost every ancient culture, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical story of Noah, and eventually into the myth of Atlantis. It is a deeply compelling narrative. It perfectly aligns with Plato's timeline of 9600 BCE. However, the scientific community remains highly skeptical. While there is evidence of a sudden climate shift during the Younger Dryas, the evidence for a comet impact is hotly contested. Furthermore, there is zero archaeological evidence of an advanced global civilization existing 12,000 years ago. We have found stone tools and the bones of hunter-gatherers, but no sunken cities, no advanced metallurgy, and no global empire. Until physical evidence is found, the Younger Dryas Atlantis remains a fascinating but scientifically unproven hypothesis. It is worth noting that we do know of one real massive landmass that was swallowed by the sea at the end of the Ice Age. Doggerland was a vast, inhabited region of rolling hills, marshes, and forests that connected Great Britain to continental Europe. As the ice caps melted around 6,500 BCE, sea levels rose, slowly inundating the land. The final blow came from the Storegga Slides, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway that triggered a colossal tsunami, drowning what was left of Doggerland. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who lived there were forced to flee to higher ground, becoming the early inhabitants of Britain and Europe. While they did not have bronze weapons or concentric cities, the oral memory of a great land sinking beneath the waves could easily have survived for thousands of years, contributing to the universal human fear of a watery apocalypse. So, if mainstream science says Atlantis is a myth and geologists say the proposed locations are natural formations, how did Atlantis become a global obsession? How did a Greek political allegory transform into a new age religion of advanced technology, aliens, and magical crystals? The answer lies in the 19th century with a man named Ignatius Donnelly. In 1882, Donnelly, a former U.S. congressman, published a book titled Atlantis, The Antediluvian World. Donnelly took Plato's story completely literally. He argued that Atlantis was the literal Garden of Eden, the cradle of all human civilization. He claimed that the Atlanteans invented the alphabet, bronze working, and astronomy, and that after their island sank, the survivors fled to Egypt, Central America, and Europe, seeding the ancient cultures of the world. Donnelly's book was a massive bestseller. It established the framework for modern Atlantology. He was the first to argue that the myths of gods from different cultures were actually just distorted memories of real Atlantean kings and queens. But Donnelly only opened the door. It was the occultists who walked through it and completely changed the mythology. In the late 19th century, Helena Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, claimed she was in telepathic contact with ancient ascended masters. She wrote that Atlantis was real, but it was inhabited by a race of spiritually advanced beings who possessed psychic powers and flew in airships. According to Blavatsky, the Atlanteans destroyed themselves through the misuse of dark magic and genetic manipulation. This esoteric version of Atlantis was further expanded by the American mystic Edgar Cayce in the early 20th century. Known as the Sleeping Prophet, Cayce claimed that while in a trance state, he could access the Akashic Records, a cosmic library of all human history. Cayce described Atlantis as a highly advanced civilization that possessed technologies rivaling the 20th century. He claimed they had airplanes, submarines, and death rays. But their ultimate power source and their ultimate undoing was a massive, highly tuned crystal that harnessed solar and terrestrial energy. According to Cayce, the Atlanteans pushed the crystal too far, causing the island to shatter and sink. Cayce also prophesied that parts of Atlantis would rise again near the Bahamas in the late 1960s. When a strange underwater rock formation was discovered off the coast of Bimini in 1968, dubbed the Bimini Road, Atlantis enthusiasts went wild, claiming it was the ruins of an Atlantean highway. Geologists, however, quickly identified it as a natural formation of beach rock. Through Donnelly, Blavatsky, and Cayce, Atlantis was no longer a Greek allegory. It had become a blank canvas onto which society could project its fascinations with lost technology, ancient magic, and hidden history. This pseudo-historical version of Atlantis is what eventually permeated pop culture, giving us everything from Marvel's Namor to DC's Aquaman and countless science fiction novels. We have explored the history, the geology, and the mythology. We know that Plato likely invented the story to teach a moral lesson. We know that the Minoan eruption provides a perfect historical template for a civilization destroyed by the sea. We know that the real sinking of Helike provided the immediate inspiration, and we know that modern occultists have transformed the myth into a tale of magical crystals and ancient superscience. But this leaves us with one final crucial question: why? Why does the myth of Atlantis endure so powerfully? Why do we desperately want it to be real? The answer lies in human psychology. The story of Atlantis taps into two of our deepest, most primal instincts: the longing for a golden age and the fear of our own destruction. Throughout history, humans have always looked backward with a sense of nostalgia. We struggle with the chaotic, imperfect world we live in, and we comfort ourselves with the idea that once, long ago, humanity was better. We were wiser, more connected to nature, and more in tune with the divine. Atlantis represents this ultimate golden age. It is the dream that we are the degraded descendants of gods rather than the evolved descendants of apes. But more importantly, Atlantis is a mirror reflecting our deepest anxieties about civilizational collapse. When Plato wrote the story, Athens was tearing itself apart through war and political corruption. Today, we face our own existential threats. We look at the escalating impacts of climate change, the rising sea levels, the threat of nuclear war, and the rapid, uncontrolled advancement of artificial intelligence. We look at our own towering skyscrapers, our global supply chains, and our immense wealth, and we realize how fragile it all is. We are the Atlanteans. We have built a global, technologically advanced civilization of unimaginable wealth. And just like the Atlanteans, we are altering the very environment that sustains us. The story of a great empire swallowed by the sea in a single day is no longer just an ancient myth. It is a very real, scientifically modeled possibility. The enduring power of Atlantis is not that it was a real place we can find on a map. Its power is that it is a cautionary tale that is always relevant. It is a reminder that no matter how great a civilization becomes, it is never immune to the forces of nature or to the consequences of its own hubris. Perhaps the true legacy of Atlantis is not a sunken city of gold waiting to be discovered by a submarine. Perhaps its true legacy is the warning it carries across the millennia, a warning from the ancient world to the modern one. Progress without wisdom is a path to destruction. The search for Atlantis will continue. Explorers will scan the ocean floors with sonar, and internet sleuths will find new patterns in satellite imagery. But the real Atlantis is already here. It is the story we tell ourselves about who we are, what we have achieved, and what we stand to lose. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of history and myth. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the legend of Atlantis, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss an exploration of the ancient world. What do you think? Was Atlantis just a philosophical allegory, a memory of the Minoans? Or is there a lost Ice Age civilization waiting beneath the waves? Let us know your theories in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning the past because the truth is often stranger than the myth.